When it has to do with giving your tithe, who do you give your tithe to? Number one, you give it to the priest. The first person that received tithe was a priest. Melchizedek was called the priest of Salem. It's not every priest that receives tithe. The priest that receives tithe is the priest that has nothing else doing except serving God. Because the Bible stated it clearly. They have no inheritance. So this arrangement is done to mark for them an inheritance. You see, in this generation, somebody is working, he's a bank manager and he's pastoring. He's a real estate mogul, and he comes and collects tithe from 2,000 people and add it to his investment. That's where there's problem. If you are a priest that you don't have any other job, that's all you are doing. Because if you study the Old Testament, you are going to discover that there are some Levites that are soldiers. There are some Levites that are farmers. It is the Levite that does not have a portion, an inheritance, that receives tithe. So if you are a real estate expert, if you are a real estate mogul, if you are a businessman who is a pastor, you can't receive tithe. There are many businessmen who are pastoring today. They collect tithe and go and invest it in their business. That's not right. It's not every priest that receives tithe. And I will show you why. Because there's an administration for tithing. The first administration is that tithe is for the welfare of the priesthood. They don't have an inheritance. They don't have a farm to go to. They don't have a business to run. They are serving the altar all the days of their lives. So part of the tithe is for their welfare. But it's also not just for their welfare. Another administration of the tithe is for administration and the running of the operation of the house of God. So for example, you have an event in the house of God. You are not going to go and beg money from outsiders. What you do is that you take from the tithe and everybody will eat it together. So both the priest and those who brought it can partake of it. For example, when we have our end of year program, where do you take the money from? You don't go and solicit for money to come and run that program. The administration of the tithe becomes for the celebration and the organization of the things of the house. Those of you who are ministers here, learn this. Don't collect tithe and go and invest it in your real estate. If you have a job, you can't take tithe. I will tell you where the tithe will go to. Any priest who is overseeing a house and has a job, the tithe is taken to the house of God. It is put in the treasury of the church. It doesn't go to the priest. The only priest who can receive tithe is one who has nothing doing. Then there is a third administration. Deuteronomy 26 verse 12. For widows, for orphans, and for strangers. Because it is part of the responsibility of the church to take care of widows that are widows indeed. Are you seeing why you can't be a bank staff or a real estate person and collect tithe and go and spend? Tithe is a sacred seed. God prescribed how it should be used. So when tithe comes in, if other administration has been met, you take it and you look for those who are widows. It is the duty of the church to support them. And Paul gave us the criteria for the kind of widow we support in 1 Timothy. A man of God collects tithe, he thinks it's time to buy car. You are joking. You will have a problem. In our era today, it's only the high priest that collect all the tithe and he builds a mansion. All the other Levites in church are dying. It is wrong to have a minister serving in the house of God who is sold out and there is no token going to him on a monthly basis. It's wrong because he doesn't have an inheritance. He has set himself apart. He left his certificate, he left everything to serve God. So even if it is the high priest that collects the tithe, if he takes the 10th portion of the tithe, the 90% of the tithe remaining is number one for the other pastors. That's the administration of tithe. And then after you take care of the other pastors, you now take care of orphans, widows, and strangers. Where we are here, sometimes people come, they say they are from Lagos, they don't have where to sleep. I say, okay, give them something to sustain them for 3 days. That's one of the duty of the tithe. We have widows here who don't have food to eat. Give them. And if we don't have those to give, sometimes we go out for orphanage visitation. Because the tithe is meant for the orphans. It's meant for the widows. It's meant for the welfare of the subordinate pastors who are the Levites. But here today, only the man of God, the set man, collects all the tithe. And there's no administration to the tithe. He buys car, he builds mansion, and he invests the rest in his real estate business. Do you see why we still keep giving tithe? Because if you stand up now and say, oh, Jesus has become the tithe, we don't need to give tithe. How do we take care of the widows? How do we take care of the orphans? If we want to run a program in-house, where would the money come from? Otherwise, people will be overburdened. You want to do graduation, you say, please sow a seed. You want to do end of year program, you say sow a seed. You want to go out for orphanage, you say sow a seed. Is it every day they are giving? People will run away from the church. This church of giving every day, what is going on? So God creates an administrative buffer to run his program without becoming overbearing on the parishioners. This is how tithe is administered. And this is why tithe has not stopped.